They were, okay? Now, the next subtopic has to do again with getting these southern states readmitted to the Union. And this bill that's going to be passed to finalize his plan is going to be known as the Wade-Davis bill. And because there was so much opposition to Lincoln's original plan, his plan ends up becoming a congressional bill known as the Wade-Davis bill. Now, it's going to support some of what Lincoln had, and it's going to make up their own rules. So who's passing this bill? The president? No. Who is? Congress. So Congress is looking at this plan that Lincoln has for the South, and they're liking not much of it, but they're willing to accept some of it in exchange for them coming up with some other things. So this congressional bill that was passed by Congress to deal with the South became known in American history as the Wade-Davis bill. And it called for stronger measures than Lincoln had put out for a southern state to be readmitted to the Union. That doesn't mean it won't listen to some of Lincoln's suggestions, but it's not going to be as easy as 10% of the people in your state that voted in the election of 1860 pledged their allegiance and you're in. Okay? That was not going to do it for these congressional members. So, the Wade-Davis bill ended up passing and stated the following three things. First of all, it did take into consideration a little bit, because the first thing that the Wade-Davis bill stated is it supported Lincoln's earlier declaration that a southern state could come into the Union when 10% of the people that voted in the election of 1860 pledged their allegiance. So they actually accepted that. But wasn't that the only thing Lincoln had in his? Right? Is that right? Well, they're going to add a couple more things, a couple more provisions. Now, what's their concern? We talked about they could not only vote, but they could also do what? If they were brought back in the Union, what could the citizens do? They could vote, but they could also what? They could hold office. Well, the second part of the Wade-Davis bill, it says, political power would be given only to Southerners that remained loyal to the Union. In other words, could Robert A. Lee ever, he could vote, but could he ever hold an office in the in the United States government? No. That would only go to Southerners who stayed loyal to the Union. How many would that have been? Big margin or small? Very small. So that was the second part of the Wade-Davis bill. It demanded that political power be given to Southerners that remained loyal to the Union. Now, what's the other concern we have? Is that the South isn't necessarily going to accept laws that abolished slavery. So the third part of the Wade-Davis bill stated that every Southern state that was readmitted back into the Union would have to put in their state constitution a law that recognized the freedom of what? Blacks. In other words, if you wanted to come into the Union as a state on the basis of the Wade-Davis bill, number one, you had to have 10% of your citizens who voted in the election of 1860 pledge your allegiance to the United States of America. Two, you had to know that only Southerners in your state that remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War would be able to hold political office, right? And third, your state, if brought back in, would have to put a new state constitution in stating that you recognize the freedom of blacks. That make sense? That's what the Wade-Davis bill said. So it was built up and sent through Congress. It was sent to the Senate and to the House for approval. And in July of 1864, the Wade-Davis bill passed by a small majority in both the Senate and the House. So, in July of 1864, the Wade-Davis bill passed in both the House and the Senate by a small majority. When a bill's passed, where does it go next? To the President for his approval or non-approval. If he approves it, it goes into law. If he doesn't approve it, he vetoes it. Okay? And Lincoln refused to sign the bill. In other words, he vetoed that bill for 2 reasons. And they make sense why he vetoed this. Now let's think back what I said. What, does Lincoln want it tougher for a southern state to get into the Union? No. And that's the first reason he vetoed it, is he thought that these rigid provisions in the Wade-Davis bill would restrict him in getting those southern states readmitted into the Union. How's he going to rebuild the Union until he gets all these seceded states back in? Does that make sense? So these restrictions and this rigorous demands by Congress of you have to do this and you have to do that, was that going to be positive? Are those southern states going to be just fired up to get in? No, they're going to give you one of these. Okay, right? Here you go. And Lincoln knew that if he didn't get them all back, he might as well get none back, right? So that's one reason he vetoed. Second reason is he wasn't against the state constitutions stating that you had to accept slavery, but he felt we needed what instead? Not a state constitution, a federal. In other words, he wanted an amendment to the United States Constitution stating the freedom of slaves. Did we ever do that? How did we free the slaves? By the Emancipation Proclamation, a presidential order. Is it in the Constitution at this time that slaves are free? And that's what Lincoln's saying. Wait a minute. We don't want it in the state constitution stating slaves are free. We don't even have it in the national constitution. So, 2 reasons he vetoed the Wade-Davis bills, because he thought the rigid provisions would keep him from getting those southern states back, and he wanted them all. And 2, he felt like that constitutional amendment shouldn't be in a state constitution before it was in a federal or our big constitution. Okay? Now, the problem with all this is that Lincoln's not going to get a chance to get any of this done, is he? Because he's going to be assassinated. But before he was assassinated, there was a planned kidnapping of President Lincoln that we're going to tell you about. A lot of people don't know that. It wasn't the intention of these people to kill the president. The intention was to kidnap him. Now when you kidnap somebody, what are you looking in return? Some sort of ransom. We'll show you what these people's ransom was. Okay. Like I mentioned, whether or not Lincoln would have won acceptance to his plan for the South was never answered. And as you can imagine, Lincoln had a lot of enemies after the Civil War. Not only from the South, but from the North as well. Not everybody agreed with him, especially the radical Republicans. Okay? Matter of fact, if you talk to historians, Lincoln might have been one of the most hated men in American history at this point in his career, after the Civil War. He had enemies in both the North and the South. 2 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, you remember that? Lincoln gave a speech at the White House. Okay? 2 days after the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln addressed a crowd that was standing outside the White House. He stood outside the White House and gave a speech. One of the men in the audience listening to Lincoln's speech 2 days after the surrender of Appomattox was John Wilkes Booth. He was at the White House listening to the president's speech 2 days after the Confederates surrendered Appomattox. And John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer, and he hated everything President Lincoln stood for. Hated everything he stood for. And he was in the crowd that day. He was an interesting guy. He blamed Lincoln for all the South's ills following the war, and he wanted revenge. He was a big-time Southern sympathizer who lived in the North. And he hated Lincoln's guts, he hated everything he stood for, and he wanted revenge. And he was in the crowd when Lincoln spoke that day, 2 days after the surrender. So in the late summer of 1864, Booth actually began developing a plan to kidnap, not kill, President Lincoln. Okay, in the late summer of 1864, John Wilkes Booth actually began to develop a plan to kidnap the president, not assassinate him. Now, Booth planned to kidnap the president. He was going to take him to Richmond, Virginia. And what was the ransom going to be? He'd return Lincoln for what? You'd think maybe money, right? He wanted all Confederate prisoners of war released. His plan was to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, Virginia, and demand that all Confederate prisoners of war were released. That was his plan. He didn't plan to kill him. He wanted all those Confederate prisoners of war released that we still had not released. Well, Booth didn't think he could do this on his own, so by January of 1865, he organized a group of co-conspirators. In other words, people to help him. So he knows he can't do this kidnapping by himself, so he organizes a group of co-conspirators. Would these be people that were Southern sympathizers? Yes. Would these be people that hated Lincoln almost as much as Booth? Yes. And here are the list of the co-conspirators that will be involved in the possible kidnapping, but obviously the later assassination of the president. Okay? First fella, they're all on your ID sheet, was John Surratt Jr. And what was his position? He was a Confederate courier during the war. What's a courier? What's that? Messenger, yep. And he was kind of Booth's second in command. He was his right-hand guy. He was like second in command in this plot. John Surratt Jr., he was a Confederate courier during the Civil War, and Booth kind of named him his second in command for this kidnapping plot. The next co-conspirator was a guy by the name of Samuel Arnold. Samuel Arnold. And he was a boyhood friend of Booth's who also served in the Confederate Army. He was a boyhood friend of Booth who served in the Confederate Army. As was Michael O'Laughlin. He was a boyhood friend of Booth also who served in the Confederate Army. So Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin are boyhood friends of John Wilkes Booth. Both served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War and are going to become co-conspirators in this kidnapping plot. The next fellow was George Atzerodt. George Atzerodt. And he was a Confederate blockade runner during the Civil War. He was a Confederate blockade runner. What's a blockade runner, JC? What's a person who runs a blockade to? Vicksburg would be a perfect example of where there were a lot of blockade runners. What were these blockade runners sneaking into Vicksburg in the latter stages of the Union assault? Food, medicine, blankets. They were blockade runners. When they had a blockade around, they would sneak at night through and get people. And did they make money doing that? They didn't do that for free. You know what I mean? So very wealthy people in Vicksburg who needed medicine would pay a high price for a blockade runner to bring that to them. Okay? And that's what Atzerodt was. He was a Confederate blockade runner during the Civil War. Another guy involved was a guy by the name of David Harold. And he was actually a pharmacy clerk in the North at the time. They called him half-witted. What does that mean? Not very bright. Okay? Half-witted pharmacy clerk by the name of David Harold. Another co-conspirator was Edmund Spangler. And ironically, he was a stagehand at Ford's Theater. He was a stagehand at Ford's Theater. Also did a little carpenter work on the side. But his job was he was a stagehand at Ford's Theater. The next guy was probably the most brutal. And his name was Lewis Powell, also called Lewis Payne. He had an alias, so some people called him Lewis Powell, some called him Lewis Payne. But he was probably the most rugged of the bunch. He was very well trained in guerrilla tactics during the Confederate War, during the Civil War as a soldier. What are guerrilla tactics? Almost borderline what? The T word. Terrorism. Guerrilla tactic in the Vietnam War is that the North Vietnamese would strap a hand grenade down the back of a baby's diaper, and when the American soldier picked up the baby to play with them and jiggled the diaper, the hand grenade blew up the baby and the soldier. Those are guerrilla tactics. They're almost terrorist type tactics. True story. So above and beyond the rules of war would be someone that uses guerrilla tactics. So this Lewis Payne or Powell, he was a rough dude. Okay? Another co-conspirator was a physician, a doctor, by the name of Samuel Mudd. He was a Southern doctor. And he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, because you know the story about Booth jumping off the stage and breaking his leg when he shot Lincoln. I'll tell you that, but he did. And he was the doctor that treated Booth after his injury, after he shot the president, which we'll talk about. So he becomes a co-conspirator. Probably, poor guy, probably in the wrong place at the wrong time, actually. You know what I mean? And the final conspirator was a woman by the name of Mary Surratt, which would have been John Surratt Jr.'s mother. And she was also a Southern sympathizer, and where she got in trouble is Booth and this crew used her tavern and her boarding house to have meetings about this kidnapping and later assassination. So when she got tied in, that's how she got tied in. To give you a prelude, she becomes the first woman in American history ever to be hanged or hung because of this. So Mary Surratt was a Southern sympathizer who allowed Booth to use her tavern and boarding house for meetings during this plot. The tavern was in Virginia and the boarding house was in Washington, D.C. But they used both places to plot this first kidnapping, then assassination. And that's how she got tied up. Well, here's how the kidnapping plan was, and we'll end with this today. On March 17, 1865, Booth and his co-conspirators were planning to capture the president because he was supposed to attend a play in Washington, D.C. Ironically, because what happens when he attends the play later? It's assassinated. Not the same play. So they had this plan together. On March 17, 1865, the president was going to attend a play performance. He liked those. Just outside of Washington, D.C., not at Ford's Theater. And Booth and his co-conspirators planned to capture him or kidnap him during that play. That was the plan. Okay? Well, what did Lincoln do that foiled the plan? He didn't go to the play. Instead of attending the play performance, he decided to give a speech at the last minute at a local hotel. So they're already there at the theater waiting to kidnap him, and he doesn't show because he changes his mind and gives a speech at a local hotel instead. Booth was so upset about Lincoln foiling his kidnapping plan that his plans changed from kidnapping to what? Assassination. So they were planning on kidnapping President Lincoln at this play on March 17, 1865. Lincoln changes his plans. He instead gives a speech at a local hotel, and Booth is so upset that he changes his plans from kidnapping to assassination. And that'll take us to our next subtopic tomorrow, which is the assassination of President Lincoln. Okay? Good job today, kiddos. If you're not going to be here tomorrow for FFA or whatever, which some of you are not, make sure you get on the website and get this lecture, because when you come back Wednesday, we will continue.